Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to Denver and to the ACLU Biennial Leadership Conference of 2017. Now, I know you've actually all been welcomed this morning by our Colorado hosts and others, but I wanted to be the second to welcome you. And I would also like to start by extending a special welcome to our friends from Texas. Where did Terry Burke go? There we are. Texas is in the house. And Florida, where's Howard Simon? Where's Howard? Where are you? Oh, there you are. Okay, Florida. And Georgia and everybody else who has weathered the storm, who got here and is drying off and getting ready to go back to work after Harvey and Irma. So welcome to all. Let's give them a big hand for, for what they've had to put up with. So how many of you were at your first ACLU biennial? That's great, wonderful, all these new people. And how many of you were at the biennial in Seattle, the last biennial? That's great too. The Girl Scout song of the Make New Friends but Keep the Old. So it's wonderful to have you all. Now, a couple of things have happened since we gathered in Seattle in 2015. There was an election. Has that come to your attention? There was a total eclipse of the federal government. The White House became a black hole for human rights and human decency. And entirely too many states have continued to go further to the dark side on immigrants' rights, reproductive freedom, voting rights, and unfortunately, I could go on. As you know, the ACLU works in about 14 different areas of civil rights and civil liberties, and evidently, so does the Trump administration, just from the opposite direction. At times, doesn't it seem as if they're determined not only to exhaust all of our civil liberties, but also to exhaust every last person on the ACLU staff? So where I'd like to start our time together as leaders of the ACLU is to recognize and appreciate the incredible efforts that our staffs, national and affiliate, have made since the election in rising to the challenge of Trumpism. I think their work has been amazing, both in quality, quantity, and sheer speed in the face of the constant barrage of attacks on almost everything we believe in. So can we please start with a hearty round of applause for our staffs? So, as you know, another thing that has changed since 2015 is that the ACLU has never been more visible or more appreciated. You all know that our membership just about quadrupled since the election. One new member said to me, "Thank God for the ACLU. Without you, there'd be no hope." Another person said to me, "You know, I feel like the only government we have right now is the ACLU." So this is a heavy responsibility. We have a lot to talk about this weekend, both about the amazing work the staff has been doing, about our strategies for meeting the challenges to come, and we lay leaders have a lot to talk about in terms of how we can best do our jobs in supporting that work. So in January, shortly after the inauguration, as the mean-spirited executive orders started to fly, I went to an immigration rally in Lower Manhattan that was right opposite the Statue of Liberty. And New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio had what I thought was a great line. He said that he thought that the Trump-era counterpart to the Obama mantra, "Yes, we can," remember those days, "Yes, we can"? He said he thought that the Trump-era counterpart should be, "No, he can't." So I've actually given a number of speeches where I get everybody to chant, "No, he can't," but I still like "Yes, we can" better. So that's going to be your answer. I'm going to ask you a few questions. So if you don't have food in your mouth right now, don't put anything in so that you're going to be able to not talk with your mouth full. So my first question to you: can we stop Donald Trump and his henchmen from making America hate again? Yes, we can we stop him from turning immigrants' dreams of a better life into a nightmare of fear? Yes, we can we show the American people why it's not actually true that the greatest recent victim of judicial injustice is Sheriff Joe Arpaio? Okay, Alessandra, Cecilia, that one was for you. I could go on here too because we have so much to do. We need to fight the insane idea that the news media are a greater danger to Americans than white supremacists. We need to fight the very funny joke of telling law enforcement officials that they should be roughing up suspects more. We need to fight the demonization of transgender people. We need to fight the Orwellian Election Integrity Commission, whose goal is just to stack the deck even higher against equal voting rights. So we just have a lot of work to do. And it won't always be easy, and we won't always win. But here's my last and most important question to you. Can we commit ourselves to giving this fight everything we have? Yes, we can, and yes, we must. So that's our work that we're going to be doing this weekend. For our opening plenary lunch, we're going to be taking a look at, we're going to be taking a look at the interplay between our work toward racial equality and our historic commitment to content-neutral protection of speech. Now, of course, this is not a new issue for the ACLU. We've uncovered a 1934 pamphlet that some of you may know about, which is called "Shall We Defend Free Speech for Nazis in America?" And in 1934, think of what was going on then around the world, the organizers of the ACLU answered the question, yes, making the argument that the ACLU has to defend even the speech we hate. It's also interesting to me that in that 1934 pamphlet, the founders of the ACLU drew the line at defending armed demonstrators, violence, or those who interfere with the rights of others. So as you're all very well aware, the traumatic events in Charlottesville generated both praise and criticism of the ACLU from many directions. Virginia's governor blamed the ACLU for the violence, even though the organizer, Mr. Kessler, had specifically sworn an affidavit that he was going to hold a peaceful demonstration. So after the events at Charlottesville, which we still have so much to talk about, some people, like the questioners the 1934 ACLU pamphlet addressed, thought the ACLU had gone too far in protecting hateful speech. Others, hearing our staff explain that because we draw the line at between speech and violence, we would not represent white supremacists brandishing weapons, complained that perhaps the ACLU was retreating from our commitment to speech. We planned today's panel and conversation as a last-minute addition to the weekend's program so that we can turn this highly charged moment into a teaching moment and a learning moment. Like the ACLU's founders, we need to think and talk about how to explain the rationale for our First Amendment policy, not only to the general public, but among ourselves. Why do we defend the speech we hate? We need to consider whether some of our time-worn maxims, the antidote to bad speech is more speech, the marketplace of ideas will result in the best arguments winning out, whether those still ring true in an era where white supremacists have a friend in the White House. We need to talk about our belief that free speech is not the enemy of equality, but rather a necessary component of the fight for equality. We need to listen to others in our very large and diverse organization. We have a very large and diverse staff all around the country. We also have very large and diverse boards. And many people have had different experiences, different life experiences, and have different points of views. And we need to listen to each other and understand those points of views. Finally, we need to discuss how we can avoid having our defense of free speech undermine our racial equality work without sacrificing any principle. On a practical level, as the National Board was hearing this morning, we've already created a working group, which is headed by Legal Director David Cole, and has 7 national litigators and 5 affiliate legal directors, and with input invited from all around the ACLU, to consider whether we can develop guidelines and best practices for addressing whether, when, and how we decide to take on cases that involve racial justice and free speech issues. So to help us think and talk more productively about these issues, we have invited 3 eminent civil rights scholars and activists, all of whom believe deeply in the First Amendment and in equality. And introducing you, you have, I think, a fuller bio on each of them in your materials, but Dr. Mary Frances Berry is an eminent historian and scholar at Princeton. So you'll know that Dr. Berry was chair of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission under 4 presidents. Professor Charles Lawrence has taught about these issues at more than 4 preeminent law schools and has written groundbreaking pieces. Professor Lawrence. He's written groundbreaking pieces on constitutional law and equality, including Words That Wound. Last but not least, Jamil Jaffer, until recently the ACLU's deputy legal director, who is now the founding director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Okay, again, you have more details about all these people and their very illustrious biographies in the materials. But I've invited the panelists, instead of giving them specific mandates, I've invited them to tell us whatever they would like us as leaders of the ACLU to hear. So we're going to start with some opening remarks from each in counter-alphabetical order, starting with Professor Lawrence, and then Jamil Jaffer, and then Dr. Berry. And then that will be followed by a question and answer and discussion. So I'm going to invite Professor Lawrence to take the podium.
Thank you, Susan. And thank all of you for the incredible work you've been doing on behalf of all of us. It's 1951. I'm 7 years old. I'm sitting in the front seat next to my father, who's listening to the car radio as he drives. The voice on the radio is Joe McCarthy. I do not understand all of what is going on, but I can hear the menace and threat in this man's voice, and I can see my father's tightened jaw. The vein standing out is his temple and on the back of his hands. I've overheard the adult conversations with visitors around my parents' kitchen table. Talk of witch hunt, friends in the party, HUAC, and the FBI. I don't ask my parents what this is about, but I know my parents and their friends are among the hunted. I have nightmares of white men coming to our house and my parents running out the back door. I know the feel of the state suppressing speech. My commitment to the First Amendment comes from knowing the harm done by the First Amendment's nullification. My 7-year-old self learned that lesson from my father's body. I have another image of my father, standing outside of our car surrounded by a crowd of white men. My family is traveling south to visit relatives in Mississippi, where both my parents grew up, passing through a small town in South Carolina. I cannot hear the men's word, but I know this is not a conversation in search of truth. Their words are threat, intimidation. They assert power over my father and his family. They remind him that we do not belong here, that our lives are worthless in this place, that they have acted on this belief before and will act on it again. When Anthony asked me to come and speak to you today, he said, "Chuck, I just want you to come and say what you really think about this problem and help us talk to one another about it." For 3 weeks, I've struggled over what I will say, trying to make sense of what I know, of what I've learned in a lifetime of watching and feeling what it means to live in this still unredeemed democracy where I fight each day, side by side with good people like you, to make ours a nation true to its creed. I will start by sharing with you some of the questions I ask myself and offering my tentative answers. I ask you to listen not like lawyers preparing briefs in response, but as colleagues and friends, listening with mind and heart, listening not only to the analysis I offer, but also to what I feel. Listen to what you feel as well. Question 1, is this a protest or a mob? Do I know the difference between a protest and a mob? The white supremacist in Charlottesville felt like a mob to me. I know what it feels like when people take to the streets to push hard with their political views, to persuade me that their vision or values would better serve our democracy. I also know what threat feels like. I know the bully, the mob that believes my life is worthless. Yes, the mob has a message that contains content. The content is my body, my person, and its worthlessness. The content is also a notice, a reminder, a promise that violence accompanies this speech, that it always has. I know in my body that this particular speech produced and justifies the killings of my brothers and sisters in Ferguson, Staten Island, Cleveland, Oakland, Baltimore, Charleston, and more locations of America's persistent human slaughter than I can name or bear to think about. I know that the content of Klan speech, Nazi speech, promises that we will kill you and yours tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The mob's roar of "you will not replace us" was not a metaphor. It was an expression of intentional annihilation. The violence and intimidation of the march in Charleston is magnified when the mob disperses and becomes a national network using the internet to engage in strategic, targeted threats and crowdsourced cyberbullying directed at professors, journalists, judges, and anyone who speaks up for equality. As I write this talk, my phone rings. A colleague and good friend asks if I have a couple of minutes to talk with him. I can hear in his voice that he is shaken. He has just come from teaching his first class. He has passed out folded tent cards for students to write their names on. One student has drawn an image of Pepe the Frog, followed by the letters K-E-K besides his name. My friend recognized this symbol as anti-Semitic, as a purposeful, intentional invocation of Nazi ideology and the history of ovens and genocide. He suspected that he had been targeted by a right-wing student group because he is Jewish and progressive. An internet search revealed a video of the same student pledging his allegiance to a club called Proud Boys and promising to beat up leftist Jews. At my suggestion, my friend sent an email to the student with copies to his dean, the university president, the Hawaii Human Rights Commission. The email clearly stated that all points of view and allegiances are welcome in his classroom, but display of hate symbols that create a hostile environment are not. The professor requested a meeting to discuss these parameters as a condition of the student's return to class. The student came to the meeting accompanied by another member of Proud Boys who physically assaulted the department chair when she would not allow him to enter his office. After security officers removed that student, my friend had a discussion with the student enrolled in his class, during which the student agreed he would come to the class without his Nazi symbols. That afternoon, the professor found his letter to the student, posted along with his email address, office location, home address on the website 4chan. Page after page of comments replete with racist, anti-Semitic, threatening, and assaulting screeds were posted in reply. I was stunned to find this neo-Nazi group on our quiet campus in Hawaii, but Trump has emboldened his base. This is happening all over the country, and people of color, immigrants, Jews, Muslims, and progressive intellectuals are the primary targets of these internet attacks. Of course, it is not just the targeted individuals who are silenced. As with cross-burning and the lynching, these show-of-force cyber attacks on individuals are intended as a message to others. Keep silent, know your place, or you will be next. Another colleague, never one to be shy about speaking out on important public matters, told me when a reporter called her to get her reaction to the events in Charlottesville, she did not call him back. If I know what I saw in Charlottesville was a mob, if I know that these so-called Proud Boys intend to silence speech, should I forget what I know about Joe McCarthy and COINTELPRO and my nightmare of the government coming for my parents because of what they believed? Certainly not. I want you to carry the truth of both of these stories as we do this difficult work. It requires deep empirical, historical, social, structural understanding to discern who is silencing whom, with what tools of violence and coercion, and at what cost to our democracy. Question 2, are there reasons to treat white supremacy differently from other ideas? I believe that we should defend the expression of all ideas, even those with which we disagree. I do not believe the ACLU should abandon this bedrock principle that for a century has served us so well. But what if this particular idea, white supremacy, Nazism, negates my humanity, asserts my non-citizenship, excludes me from democracy's conversation, calls for my extermination, makes possible and then justifies the murder of my son or daughter? What should I do with what I know about our country's history? That my non-humanness was central to the self-evident truth of human equality proclaimed by the founders and the Constitution. If I know that the disease of racism lives with us still, if the science of implicit bias has proven that white supremacy is not the belief of the lonely dissenter, but an ideology that infects all of our institutional practices, does this make it different from other ideas? Does the injury that it does, not just to me and other people of color, but to all of us, make it different than the injury of other offensive or unpopular views? The moral mandate of the 14th Amendment commits us to act affirmatively to disestablish the structural inequalities created by slavery and the ideology that justifies those inequalities. If white supremacy is more than an idea like any other, if it is an American sickness that infects us all, establishing structures of exclusion, is defending unpopular ideas the correct analytical frame? Again, I ask these questions not to argue that we should abandon our bedrock principle that we should protect all speech, but I do ask you to take my questions seriously and answer them with more than a re-recitation of the principle. I submit that an open-minded consideration of these questions might lead us to a new way to hold and act on the bedrock principles of the First Amendment, a way that serves those principles more fully rather than endangering them. Question 3, when do Nazi marchers become a paramilitary arm of the state? The white supremacist march in Virginia felt no different than a Trump campaign rally to me. The Make America Great signs were replaced by swastikas and chants of blood and soil, but the message was the same. Trump's equivocations, his refusal to condemn the mob, his pardon of Sheriff Arpaio confirmed my intuition. White supremacy is his base. He was signaling to them that they had done well in Charlottesville. This was their assigned role in a larger political project of state-sponsored racism. Jeff Sessions, Justice Department, the Republican Congress, and the state legislatures would take care of the gerrymandered districts, voter suppression, racial profiling, deportation, police violence, reverse discrimination suits, and the prison industrial complex. They would outsource the Nazi march and the crowdsourced cyber terrorism to private racists who act unencumbered by the Constitution's troublesome restrictions. Better yet, those subcontractors could invoke the Constitution's protection. We have seen this before in our history when the Southern planter class left the dirty work of burning crosses and lynching to the Klan, when the Southern sheriffs handed Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner over to the mob. In his discussion of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, Erwin Coulter notes that, quote, the incitement to hatred recognized by its audience as being approved by the state, either because it's promulgated through state officials and networks, or because government agencies themselves participate in acts of dehumanization and demonization, demands special concern. Traditional First Amendment analysis treats the march in Charlottesville as a case of government silencing speech the government opposes. We must frame the case this way when we speak for Nazis in court. If we know this framing is fiction, that the marchers who seek our representation speak inspired by and in concert with a racist government in power, should we pretend we do not know that? Do the racists who seek us out as lawyers do so precisely because our representation helps create this fiction? When we speak in court on their behalf, do we tell a story that changes them from threatening mob to peaceful protesters, from shock troops for an anti-immigrant homophobic state to an unpopular minority victimized by state oppression? Are we allowing them to use us as a signal flag of legitimacy? How do we talk to one another about what we should do? Question 4. Why is it so hard for those of us who share a commitment to free speech and equality to talk to one another? It doesn't help that so many of us are lawyers, advocates in an adversarial system, where there are winning and losing arguments, where we must draw bright lines and weigh arguments as if some mathematical equation could determine whether we should give priority to the First or 14th Amendment. Legal argument relies upon shared assumptions, experience, and understanding. if we weigh the injury done by hate speech against the harm that the regulation of hate speech might do to free speech, we assume the smart people with shared values will be weighing the same things. But our world is more complicated than that. Those of us who know racism as the objects of racism's dehumanization know the injuries of Charlottesville differently than those of you who choose to ally yourselves with us because you believe in the principle of racial equality. I do not know the injury of patriarchy the way that Mari Matsuda knows it. I love Anthony Romero, and he knows I will stand with him against the homophobic mob. But when that mob is hunting for a gay man, they are not coming for me. When black and brown colleagues tell us that they feel betrayed by the decision to defend the marchers in Charlottesville and by the arguments the ACLU has made defending that decision, you may feel that they are saying you are untrustworthy as a colleague or less than fully committed to fighting racism. As I prepared this talk, I worried that some of you might hear the same accusations in my words today. I admire and respect David Cole for his brilliance and courage as a lawyer. I trust his intentions and his moral commitments completely. He is a close and dear friend. We raised our children together. We have seen each other through crisis and sadness and rejoiced in each other's triumphs and good fortune. I am not embarrassed to call what we and our families feel for each other love. I share this private and personal relationship to say I know how hard this conversation must be. When I say to David, you must listen hard and hear how America's racism assaults and injures me each day, each hour, because as a privileged white man, you do not know this injury in your bones. He might hear this as ad hominem, or worse, as an accusation that he lacks empathy and does not care. I tell David my stories because I trust him in our friendship. I trust he knows I speak my true thoughts and feelings because I am certain that he cares. But even were this not true, I would take the risk of misunderstanding because the ACLU must have this conversation. We must have this conversation because we cannot do our most important work without it. I know that some of you felt betrayed by David's essay in the New York Review of Books and felt betrayed when Anthony supported David in writing the piece on the organization's behalf. You felt that David had taken the very real and complex problems that some of you had raised about this issue and reduced them to the simplistic trope that it would be much easier for the ACLU to represent only those with whom we agree. You were troubled even more by the decision to publish the piece given Anthony's request that the staff refrain from raising your concerns in public to give the organization time to engage in a thoughtful internal process. I share your concerns with the ACLU's traditional approach to white supremacists, to representing white supremacists. I understand why many of you felt that both the timing and the tone of David's piece violated the spirit of the thoughtful internal conversation that Anthony advised. But I want to speak in defense of David's piece. I believe its publication served an important institutional responsibility to clearly state our commitment to the bedrock First Amendment principle that we must protect all speech from government censorship. A clear restatement of our commitment to that principle is even more important when we are about to or are engaged in a serious and thoughtful internal conversation about how to hold firm to that principle while we discern ways to act on the principle so that the First Amendment and our democracy are better served. I think it is important to remember the different and multiple roles that all of you play in this organization. As National Legal Director, I want to submit that David wrote his piece not to respond to the careful and complex concerns that many of you have raised within the organization. David wrote a lawyer's brief to an audience of outsiders, making an argument that would not come back to bite him or any of us when we are representing a group of Palestinians or demonstrators from Black Lives Matter. He knows that for the time being, all of us must argue cases within the framework of existing First Amendment law, with all of its abstractions and refusals to account for the injuries to free speech done by ideologies and structures of racism, sexism, homophobia, and class. In the meantime, we must continue our thoughtful internal conversation. I believe we can maintain the bedrock principle that has served the ACLU so well, even as we hear and respond fully to what our young colleagues are teaching us about injury. I am certain you good lawyers are bright enough to discern how to serve that principle more fully by acknowledging the new threats to our democracy, where a racist government inspires and colludes with racist mobs to deny equality and suppress speech. The ACLU has done this before. We did not always recognize that there is a principled way to distinguish the content regulation of sexist, racist, or homophobic speech that creates a hostile work environment or denies some students equal access to education from the same speech in a public forum. The principle that we must defend all speech content does not require us to defend every speaker in every time and place. We need not pretend we cannot tell when a client seeks our representation to dress assault, threat, and terrorism in the First Amendment's cloak. I am glad that the ACLU will not abandon its commitment to representing all ideas against government suppression. I know the continuing truth of a 7-year-old's nightmare. I know that Jeff Sessions is no better than Joe McCarthy and that he will come for me if we give him away. But he will also gladly let the Klan and the Nazis and the Proud Boys do his dirty work for him. If we care for free speech and our democracy, we must know that the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment are inseparable. We must defend them both, not each in its separate place, but together as the challenge and the promise of our civil liberties. We must listen to each other and trust one another. And in Anthony's words, be kind to one another. This is hard, long-distance work. That's why we call it struggle. I, for one, am glad I'm in this struggle with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah, thank you, Professor Lawrence. We're now going to hear from Jamil Jaffer.
It's great to be back at the ACLU. Thanks to Susan and Anthony for inviting me to participate in this conversation. And thanks also to Professor Lawrence and Dr. Berry for letting me share the stage with them. I honestly feel like I have so much to learn from Professor Lawrence and Dr. Berry that I should probably just yield my time. But since I came all the way to Denver, this particular conversation is very difficult for me, as I know it is for many of you. It's difficult because I think of myself as deeply committed to both free speech and racial equality. It's difficult as well because many people I respect think of this issue very differently than I do. And it's difficult because I know, including from personal experience, that the harms of racist speech can be lasting and profound. I don't assume that my own limited experience tells me everything there is to know about the injuries that racist speech causes. But I know that these injuries are substantial, and I'd reject any conception or defense of free speech that required us to trivialize or dismiss them. So I've been struggling with the same questions as many of you. I want to try to explain why I continue to think that the ACLU should represent hateful speakers in some cases. I want to propose to you that you should see this work as admirable and valuable, in part for the contribution it makes to the cause of racial justice. Why should we represent speakers whose views are antithetical to ours? I think we do this work in part because we believe that the freedom of speech is a right that belongs to every human equally, whatever his or her beliefs. We believe this because the right to speak is almost inseparable from the right to exist, or at least the right to exist as an autonomous thinking being. When we represent people we disagree with, we're underscoring that the right to speak is a right that belongs to humans by virtue of their humanity. We make this point especially powerfully when we represent people whose views are repellent to us. Now, recognizing free speech as a human right doesn't answer many questions, I admit. After all, free speech isn't the only human right we care about. I still think, though, that it's a useful starting point. To recognize someone as human requires extending to her, at least presumptively, a right to speak. Our representation of hateful speakers also reflects a belief that exposing hateful ideas to public criticism and condemnation is the surest way to contain or correct them. There's plainly an element of faith in that. But allowing hateful speakers to speak publicly exposes those speakers to opposing views, and occasionally that can lead those speakers to change their minds. It's a mistake to believe that every hateful speaker is beyond our reach or beyond redemption. I recently heard Fred Phelps' granddaughter talk about why she repudiated the Westboro Baptist Church. She was the social media director for what is surely one of the most hateful organizations active in this country, but in the course of her work, for the church, she engaged with people who disagreed with her, and those people persuaded her to interrogate her own beliefs and eventually to disown them. All of us know of others whose views were transformed in similar ways. Many Americans who support gay marriage today grew up with hateful views of gay people. Their views changed when they interacted with others. Even when public condemnation doesn't change the minds of individual hateful speakers, it plays an important role in solidifying societal rejection of their views. The Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville was grotesque as well as tragic. But in the weeks since, many Americans who were previously in denial about the existence of these ugly forces or in denial about the strength of these forces have begun to confront a reality that they previously ignored. In the days after Charlottesville, there were counter rallies in Los Angeles, Seattle, Washington, and New York. In Boston, 40,000 people participated in the Fight Supremacy rally, outnumbering white supremacists almost 1,000 to 1. The CEO of every major technology company spoke out, as did many political leaders, both Republicans and Democrats. 3 days ago, the House and Senate passed by unanimous consent a joint resolution that labeled the killing of Heather Heyer a domestic terrorist attack and urged the president to speak out against white nationalists and white supremacists. This process of confronting hate collectively is crucial. It's through this process that societal norms evolve and solidify. It's through this process that our society becomes more fair and more just and more humane. There are other reasons to value this work. Our power in the courts comes in large part from the perception that we're principled in our defense of liberty. Judges who might otherwise be unsympathetic to our left-wing clients are more sympathetic because they know we make the same arguments on behalf of right-wing clients. Our opposition to the death penalty would be far less credible if we opposed only the execution of people we liked. Our advocacy against torture would be far less persuasive if we didn't object to the torture of people whose views we despised. It's because we stand up for people we disagree with that judges listen to us when we stand up for people we agree with. The ACLU couldn't abandon its representation of hateful speakers without compromising its ability to represent everybody else. There's another reason for this. When the ACLU represents hateful speakers, it's often defending protections that have been especially valuable to racial justice advocates in the past, and that are especially valuable to racial justice advocates today. The doctrines that limit the discretion of officials who consider permit applications, that protect advocacy of violence that falls short of incitement, that limit the government's power to punish economic boycotts. These doctrines are valuable to us. If you believe that the white supremacists have allies in the White House, as I do, then these doctrines are especially valuable to us because we have more to fear than they do from the abuse of government power. I don't need to remind you that when the Attorney General condemns hate speech, the acronym he has in mind isn't KKK. It's BLM or BDS. I don't want to be naive about this. The fact that courts protect hateful speech by white supremacists doesn't mean that they'll protect controversial speech by black people and brown people, still less that they'll protect it to the same extent. But it is nonetheless a fact that the civil rights victories of the 1960s and 70s, cases like Edwards versus South Carolina, Cox versus Louisiana, Street versus New York, NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware, these cases wouldn't have been possible without First Amendment principles that were recognized for the first time in cases involving hateful speakers like the KKK. A lot of the ACLU's post 9/11 advocacy was predicated on those same principles, principles established in cases involving vile speakers. Hundreds of American Muslims have been prosecuted under the material support statute since 9/11, but far more would be in prison today if it weren't for the Supreme Court's 1967 decision in Brandenburg v. Ohio, which involved the prosecution of a white supremacist. You don't have to believe that the First Amendment protects everybody alike in order to believe that an erosion of protections for white supremacists would mean an equal or greater erosion of protections for people like us. So I think you should continue to represent speakers you disagree with, including white supremacists and others whose message is hateful. The challenge, and it is a challenge, is to do this work in a way that gives full effect to your commitment to racial justice and that shows your fundamental solidarity with the communities you represent and the partners you work with. This begins with thinking carefully about which cases you take on. Some of the groups we're talking about are trying to start a race war. They're interested in the exchange of bullets, not in the exchange of ideas. I understand that National has said it won't represent protesters who carry guns. I think that's good. I hope you'll also refuse to represent speakers who restrict your ability to respond substantively to their speech. When you represent these clients, you have a responsibility to forcefully condemn their views and to encourage others to do that too. If a prospective client wants to tie your hands, you shouldn't represent him. You can't leave any room for doubt about where you stand. I also hope you'll work as closely as possible with groups who are likely to be targeted by your client's speech. In some contexts, it may even be possible to bring these cases with those groups. In most contexts, you can at least alert them beforehand that the case is coming, and you can explain why the ACLU is filing it, and you can listen to how they respond. You can also partner with them in responding to hateful speech. Finally, I hope you'll consider using the resources you've managed to raise in the last 6 months to expand your work on behalf of communities that have been most affected by the policies of the current administration and by the resurgence of white nationalism. I know that the ACLU already does an enormous amount of this work. I hope it will do even more. As difficult as this conversation is, I'm glad it's taking place. When I joined the staff of the ACLU 15 years ago, you could count the number of attorneys of color on one hand. thanks to the efforts of people like Reggie Shuford and Andre Segura, and of course Anthony, Laura Murphy in DC, the ACLU has become, over time, a much more diverse organization and a much stronger organization. The very diversity of its staff has helped push to the fore fundamental questions about how the ACLU should pursue equality. This is a good thing. I don't think the ACLU should succumb to a false choice between defending free speech and defending equality, but it should acknowledge the challenges of defending both of these values. And it should embrace these tasks that are most difficult and yet most necessary, as it always has. Thank you.
You understand. Thank you, Jamil, and Dr. Berry will speak next.
Well, I'm glad I'm last because I don't have anything to say. Since they both said everything I had planned to say. For me, I don't know about you, but for me, today is, for many ways, a particularly bad time, and I've been having a bad time recently. Probably you have too. Because of all the assaults that have been taking place against people's rights and liberties. It looks like every day there's something else. And I remember during the civil rights movement, Fannie Lou Hamer used to always talk about how she was sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I guess I'm just sick and tired of being sick and tired. Every day you look up and there's something else. There's the Chelsea Manning stuff at Harvard and trying to figure out some way to go after a private institution that gets a lot of public money. ACLU ought to look into that. When it suppresses people's freedoms, and being at a place like Penn, where I know that we always try to do everything Harvard does, that bothers me. Catholic U, I read this morning, has a priest who can't speak because even though he isn't going to talk about LGBTQ issues, he believes differently from what dogma is. Worrying about whether DACA is a big deal or a small deal or no deal, the thing between Chuck and Nancy and Donald. Worried about seeing the people in St. Louis. We've already been warned by the NAACP not to go to Missouri, but we have to go, and some of you from Missouri. But now you got St. Louis, and hearing last night as I got in and turned on the TV about the 7-year-old kid who was out there in the streets peacefully protesting and was still there when the police came and rounded everybody up, which reminded me of my youngest brother who walked out of school with all the other kids during the civil rights movement because he heard Diane Nash say that they were protesting downtown, and they ran out of school with the teacher yelling at them, "Come back, come back," and went downtown to protest and ended up getting beaten up, being put in jail with my mother looking for him. So there's all this, and so I come to you then at this time, and also because every time something happens that's very tragic and gets a lot of press, we have people saying that now we're going to have a national conversation about race or about whatever. If I've been on TV once, I've been on TV 1,000 times with some reporter asking me, are we now going to have a national conversation? No, we're not. We're not. We ought to just get used to it. No, we're not. So there's a kind of fatigue. I also come from being deeply involved with a couple of nonprofit boards I'm on. I'm only on nonprofit boards, not for-profit ones. But anyway, where they have been called out recently for not doing anything about race, and because their leadership positions are #SoWhite. And that this has been going on forever, despite the fact from me and other board members. So we've been having all these task forces and trying to figure out what to do. So it is with some relief that I come here to the ACLU, where its history is an organization that has always stood for justice and is not #SoWhite. sensibly and has tried to do the right thing. And so I won't go over that history because you know it. And if you don't, go read it and you can find out about it. And one of the ideas that I was mulling over in coming here was, well, maybe this idea of selective representation, which is my label for what people are saying, is a good idea. That based on the history of slavery and Jim Crow and its many mutations, because white supremacy morphs and changes, but it maintains itself over time. And the difficulty of getting remedies, especially when it comes to black folk, racial remedies. Maybe it's right to say that we ought to selectively say that there will be no representation for those who oppose racial justice, and that would include white supremacists. I thought to myself, maybe that's a good idea. And then in my way, I started arguing with myself. And I thought, well, first of all, if you privilege racial justice, there will be people who will say, well, what about gender justice? Or what about reproductive justice, which was once called reproductive freedom, before that, abortion for all, pro-choice, whatever. We went through all these different. What about discrimination based on sexual orientation? What about disability? All marginalized groups have problems of discrimination. They just need different remedies. That's me arguing with myself. The disabled need education and accommodation. Indigenous people need sovereignty. Black folk need reparations, in my view. Latinos need nationalism. Women need equality and expectations and roles and reality. And I could go on and on and on about what all the different groups need. So then I sort of put that aside for a moment. And then I said, well, if we use selective representation, then that would just mean simply no white supremacists. They will be denied because it gives them a chance to air their views, as I have been reading and have heard people saying. It just gives them an opportunity to get out there. And I thought, examine that idea, Mary Berry. What happens when you suppress views so that people can't express their views? Do they go away? How many times have you seen in your own life and in all the protests you've been involved in and the times you've been to jail and everything else you've done, have you seen people who were repressed and when they finally more came out and did so, it was worse than what you ever had imagined? So I don't know whether that's a good idea. Also, what about when they air their views, it undermines their position, as Jameer says, with all the polling data that shows, at least in Charlottesville, and this happens every time some big episode happens, a larger public then begins to view what is going on, and you get more and more people coming out against it. So then I backed away from that a little bit. And then I said, well, maybe, the ACLU needs to modify its view because the marginalized, we don't have the power. The people, the white supremacists, they're in power, with Trump there and all that. And then I decided that, well, even when Obama was president, we didn't have all the power. You may think we did, but we didn't. And he knew we didn't. In fact, if he had tried to act like he had all the power, he wouldn't have been there very long. Besides, Trump, as offensive as I find him personally, rhetorically and in every other way, in terms of power and anti-black equal opportunity, he pales in comparison to Reagan. You have all forgotten Reagan, who started his campaign where the 3 civil rights workers were killed in Mississippi, who had his staff select and groom black folk to become Republican appointees who would oppose racial justice and mouthpiece that argument. One of them still with us is on the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, and who had a litmus test for judges. And that the Civil Rights Division at Justice, I was there, present when it happened, became a playground for turning back the clock. And a dozen or so career attorneys quit their jobs, even though some of them didn't have another job, because they couldn't stand going along with what they were doing there. But all we know about him is he had a sunny disposition, and there's a building in every state named after him, and there's a big building in Washington named after him in the airport. That's all we know. I don't call it Reagan Airport, I call it National Airport. then I said to myself, how about using, if you're asked to represent and you think there's a propensity for violence involved in this particular, with this group and the people who are asking you to help them get a permit, how about using that as a denial? Or that they have guns, as ACLU has said. Well, some people say the availability of internet porn causes violence. I don't know whether it should, and should be outlawed, but I've been to some meetings where people got up and made those arguments. What about the sheriff's deputy in South Carolina who stopped me and said I was speeding and slammed me up against the car and handcuffed me? And when I objected, said I usually shoot people for doing what you just did. And I said, what did I just do? And he said, you got out of the car, even though your hands were up and were empty. And I usually shoot people when that happened because I had a propensity for violence. Also, if you have a gun, what about Philando Castile in Memphis in 2016 with the dashboard camera recording before the shooting? He was licensed to carry a gun and had a gun. And he can be heard calmly telling the police officer he has a gun. Did he have a propensity for violence? Should he be shot? The police officer was acquitted. They all get acquitted, you know. In case you hadn't noticed that, they do. One got acquitted yesterday, I guess it was, in St. Louis. And I remember these cameras, too. I thought, well, when Obama was president, his task force announced that it would be great if all police departments had cameras, and that would solve the problem of police shooting people. And I was on some national television show where they thought I was going to say that was great. They always thinking I'm going to say something. And the guy asked me, isn't that great? President Obama says, now this problem is solved. We're going to have cameras, and it'd be there, nobody can deny, you know, whatever. I said, that's not going to happen. They're not going to get convicted. And the guy got mad at me. He said, it'll be on the camera. I said, they'll just argue that the camera doesn't show the whole thing. And police officers, as long as we are ambivalent about them, as long as they're scared, and as long as they're black folk who are black folk, we're going to have this stuff happening. Then I thought to myself, I'm not sure I want to talk about guns and violence, because here's the problem. The ACLU is asked to decide whether to represent somebody before they protest. Isn't that true? They're trying to get a permit to protest. So it's before you know exactly what's going to happen in the protest. It's before you know whether the police are going to stand down. It's before you know whether somebody's going to run over somebody. It's before you know. It's all of that before anything happens. It would be easy if it could happen, and then you could say, oh, should we go help them, you know? But it's after it has happened when the question is asked, how do I deal with this? So I am left with trying to think of what you do. First of all, I think that Jameer is right, and that the ACLU should not abandon its mission. It's too much needed because of all those things I said at the beginning. And then there's another one, social media, which is now the public square. The ACLU needs desperately to work with other people to figure out what to do about hate speech and cyber journeys of hate speech, since social media is more than ever makes it so that when we sow seeds of hatred, we can't control how and where they grow. We need to do that. But that also, here's my suggestions. Do what you do now, or what I understand you do now, which is to only take cases, not every case, take cases when you have a possibility of making groundbreaking law, when a marginalized group that fits within the rubric of what you do can find no other representation, and you think it's important. And also, I think you consider your resources and how it'll affect the docket. I looked at the website again, and there are all these issues that the ACLU deals with. There are a whole bunch of them. I can't name all of them. It's a list of things you do. See whether taking this case conflicts with some other legal matter that you have, or will make it harder for you when, whatever it is, or whatever, and just checklist, go down the list and see. The main thing, too, is to be able to explain to the public why you take cases when you do, and to be able to communicate better about why this is being done, especially if it looks like it might be controversial, and most of what you do nowadays is going to be controversial, so that people understand what you're doing and that you have systematically looked at all of these issues. And then I would add one thing that may be controversial. You should add fighting white supremacy to the lists of things you are working on. It's not on your website. And so that's all I have to say, and I have no other major thing to tell you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Berry. So we're going to start our discussion by, I'd like to invite each of our three panelists to speak to each other. If you have a question for another panelist or if there's something you'd like to say just in response to what somebody else has said. So Professor Lawrence, I'll give you the first opportunity. Is there anything you'd like to engage with?
It is on, yeah. Well, first I'd like to just thank both of my co-panelists for really, building on what I think all of us have been saying we need to think about. And I think the other thing that I wanted to just raise in terms of the specific thing that Dr. Berry talked about in terms of the fact that we can't tell when a client comes to us to take a permit what they're going to do, that I think in many of these cases, following exactly what Dr. Berry suggested, that when we are going through our checklist, that we can see that a client that's seeking our representation has a pattern and practice of engaging in their speech activities in a certain way, and not just in that march, but what are these people doing, and what are the networks that they're connected with in the other parts of their efforts. So I think one of the things I'm concerned about is that how successful many of these white supremacists have been, not just in having the speech that occurs in their march, but having the march be part of a much wider effort, and many parts of that effort are about threat and intimidation. Particularly, what Dr. Berry raised and Jameer as well about the new, extensive use of the internet to do this kind of crowdsourced cyber terrorism against people. And even when it isn't the terrorism of actually threatening the individual, which often it is, with harm, there are any number of people, who've had to get, security guards at their office doors and had to change their emails. When just before I left to come here, there was, as a result of this last thing with this little group on our campus, there was one of our cyber security specialists in the political science department was doing a workshop, for us about, how to hide all our information, for people who are getting attacked just for speaking out, in very legitimate ways, responding that you get targeted by these groups. And I think often the people who are coming to ask us to represent them in speech cases which otherwise look like a perfect, the kind of speech that we would want to protect, are also engaged in these other activities. And so I think that it's thinking through those kinds of things, whether we, when we know that this isn't, a one-shot circumstance, how we ought to think about that. And I don't pretend to have the answers for that right away, but I think those things definitely need to be considered, and we just don't need to say, well, all they're doing is seeking a permit to engage in a peaceful march. And so the first problem you have, of course, is just their representation of that, and what we always have to do as lawyers to make a determination about whether we can take a client's representation of what they're actually doing on its face value. But then I think we have this additional problem of looking at what these individuals who are seeking our representation are doing in terms of their general pattern of engaging in the discourse.
Thank you. Jamil, do you want to follow up?
Well, maybe I'll just generalize from something that Professor Lawrence said earlier. So I think that if one of the reasons I'm glad this conversation is happening is because I think that around the First Amendment in particular, many people take for granted that the First Amendment, many people think the First Amendment is what it is. And the First Amendment, as we know it, is actually very new. You know, the cases that the cases that make up what we think of as the First Amendment, almost all of them are less than half a century old. And the question of what the First Amendment is for is still very much it's a very live question. There are many other groups out there now that work on First Amendment related issues. They sometimes have understandings of the First Amendment that I think are very different from the understanding that animates the ACLU's work. And you guys have to be out there in that conversation about what the First Amendment means. And that goes beyond the specific issue we're talking about today. If you're going to have a coherent theory of the First Amendment, you have to have a theory not just about what the First Amendment protects, but about what it doesn't protect. And this is a useful conversation because it is, in part, a conversation about what the First Amendment should and shouldn't protect. But I hope you bring that same energy to conversations about campaign finance and commercial speech. You know, you should think about, you shouldn't instinctively, it's a mistake to think that First Amendment defense is a matter of attaching the First Amendment label to anything you can. That is not First Amendment defense, that's something else. First Amendment defense requires that you have a value system that informs your decision making about what is and what isn't protected. And I didn't have a great sense when I was at the ACLU of the forces that have now been marshaled for a different understanding of the First Amendment. But now that I'm outside the ACLU, I have a lot more exposure to this. And there really are a lot of, there are a lot of groups out there that are really not about the values that you guys care about. They're about deregulation, or they're about consolidation of power amongst billionaires. And the First Amendment they use the language of the First Amendment to make those arguments. And I think the ACLU has to be engaged in that conversation. And I think this is part of that conversation, but it doesn't exhaust the boundaries of what that conversation should be.
Dr. Berry? Try a little closer and see, and I'll give you mine if it's
Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I did have something else to say. Now I do, now that you said something. Let me just say that in watching organizations when they come under attack over the years, I don't mean watching myself come under attack, but watching organizations, the various civil liberties and civil human rights organizations, national organizations that I've been involved with over the years, and watching the ones who, when they get an attack on them by the public for something they did or something somebody, they behave in different ways, but the ones I most admire are the gutsy ones that see that, first of all, what they're doing, their overall mission, is still very much needed, and even more, and there's more to be done, and that who see the attack on them as a way to review what they're doing and to say, not just ignore people because they criticize you, but to say, hey, what could I add, or what could I do, but not to sort of retreat and say, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. I've seen organizations do that too. I don't admire them, and they haven't prospered. And the ones that I can sit here and think about, but I won't say to you out loud what they are. Well, I'll tell you some of them, like Planned Parenthood and so on. But other organizations that I have dealt with over the years, the ones that just go and say, okay, we're on the offensive. This is what we do. This is how we do it. We're happy to review what we're doing. You say we're not doing reproductive justice. Let's now, do that. Whatever it is. But they understand their central mission and how much it is still needed. Just as what you guys do is so much needed. I mean, I listed some things that are going on there. There are things going on all over the place where you are the best positioned to do something about those things. So I wouldn't let an internal sense of doubt or criticism or, oh, they're attacking us, maybe we, did something wrong, so maybe now we should oh, my goodness, why don't we become a racial justice organization? I heard somebody say that. There are plenty of racial justice organizations. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund, on whose board I happen to serve and have for years, we spend all of our time litigating cases involving racial justice. You do some racial justice work. We don't do civil liberties as such in ACP Legal. You got the Southern Poverty Law, those folks who do all that white supremacist stuff. There are all these organizations that have roles to play, and you do some issues in these areas, but we don't need the ACLU to become a racial justice organization. My goodness. Then who would do what you do now in civil liberties? Who's going to do that? Who? Tell me who's going to do it. I want to know who's going to do it if you don't do it. Tear down the wall. No.
Well, thank you all for giving us a lot to think about. So now we're going to move to the part of the conversation where you get to say things and ask questions. So people are already beginning to line up. I see 2 microphones out here, or they're just 2. And if you'd like to speak and you can't get to a microphone, just let somebody know, raise your hand, and somebody will approach you with a microphone for you to speak. I think I'd like to actually ask a question to kind of broaden out the conversation. So we started out with Charlottesville, so you've all been talking a lot about demonstrations and the challenge of affiliates who have a group come to them to say, we want you to defend us getting our permit and having a demonstration, when sometimes it's hard to evaluate who they are, et cetera. So that's one context. We talked a little about social media. Another circumstance that comes up all the time is when affiliates are asked to weigh in, either actually represent or just weigh in on a question of whether a controversial or provocative speaker can speak in a university. So if I could start by asking our panelists, do you have any comments on moving this to the university context? We've seen a lot of schools having a great deal of controversy over inviting Milo. And the choices, again, as I think you've been suggesting, aren't only yes or no. Sometimes I've seen Auburn just starting a program recently to try to build a context. They're using those as teaching moments to try to have the students talk first about what's controversial about the ideas and what you might do about them, and just different kinds of reactions. So what would you have to say to all the affiliates out here who also have to confront not only demonstrators, but provocative speakers coming to campus?
Well, I think one important thing is to be in touch with people at these universities, both student groups and university officials and faculty, to talk about these things before the actual events of these guys getting invited. I think another thing that's been troublesome to me is how do we think about the times when these invitations seem to be as much about provocation as about the actual conveying of an idea that is controversial. And what we do as we think about weighing in, as you say, about talking about when that's so, and not just taking at face value the idea that people are being brought only to express an idea. So that I think many of the things, even that Jameer mentioned in terms of our weighing in on one side of the value that's being talked about when we're not being asked to represent somebody in court, or even when we are saying, you know, even if we will represent you, we want the freedom to speak, you know, where we think we should be on this issue. I think the other thing, there was a recent article in The Nation that was raising this, is to think about this issue that I was raising in the protest context, and that is in which situations these requests and to have controversial speakers are being done in places where they are actually situations where there are smaller numbers of minority students, larger numbers of students who are going to be following these characters. So when I look at the places that people are going to, you know, that to go to Texas A&M instead of Austin, you know, to go to Michigan State instead of Michigan, there's some concern I have that these things are being set up in situations that you could raise questions about whether they're creating situations that just make it difficult for those students to be, you know, on that campus and get an education, which is similar to the questions I was raising about whether this is, you know, this is a mob or a protest march. You know, that the speaker comes as a, well, this is very different from any kind of protest because it's just someone that's going to come speak on an intellectual topic or whatever. I think the final thing that I always like to think about and ask universities to think about is whether when students are inviting speakers, if we're really talking about contributing to the larger intellectual and political discourse of ideas, what it means when you invite speakers that are not about that at all. You know, even the issue that was being raised about, you know, thinking about commercial speech in this context, you know, when I see, you know, Milo, I kind of think, you know, this guy's really much more about making money you know, than expressing an idea. So what if, you know, people sort of come in with this is a way to do a business of advertising yourselves to go around to these universities and make this. And so I think all of those individual things that are different about every case are important things for local groups to think about as they weigh in, particularly when they're not being directly asked to represent the person, but to think about as these issues are coming up, how should we talk about them?
Any comments on the university context?
There is a long history of universities letting student groups invite people to speak. And most universities have few rules about what kind of speakers they should get. It's usually up to once the student organization parcels out the money, and you all went to university, so colleges, you must have gone someplace where they had a student union or something, and where they had speakers come to the campus. And they've been doing that without the administration being much involved in who you get or when you get them and so on. And also it is the case that many speakers go to speak at campuses in order to make money. In fact, they get speakers' fees and they have agents who in fact charge money for them to come to speak. They may have some ideas and they may not, but they come supposedly to share their ideas. And also it is well known in the speaking industry that if you can get a lot of publicity around yourself, your speaker fees will go up. So that all of that, what that says to me is that if we have a concern today about speakers speaking on the right, going to campuses and provoking people and all the rest, the university needs to make some rules about who can speak and who can't, what the students should do, and make it uniform for everybody in any student organization that comes, and have some kind of review committee or something internally, which would save the ACLU and everybody else from having to get involved in what they do. And if I were advising them, if they asked me, if I were you, I would ask them, why don't they do that? And then we'd wait to hear from them some other time.
Jamil, do you want to comment on this, or do?
Just something very quick, which is, I do feel very strongly that an organization like the ACLU, if you're going to take on these kinds of cases, that you have an obligation, a deep obligation to be engaged in the counter speech. But at the same time, I look at people like Milo and Coulter, and these are people who exist, they're parasites on the counter speech. They wouldn't exist but for our protests. So I would like to find some way of engaging in the counter speech that doesn't make them bigger than they already are. They should be nothings. And I worry that, one not very related point, but since I have the mic, maybe I have a slight disagreement with Dr. Berry on one point here. So I just only one. I think that the ACLU has to be a racial justice organization. I think that if we're going to do these kinds of cases, we have to be the ones. We have to participate in.
You're not disagreeing with me. I didn't say it should not have racial justice on its agenda. I even suggested that it add fighting white supremacy to its agenda. I said it should not turn itself into a racial justice organization only, like the NAACP or the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, because
then I withdraw my disagreement. Yeah, but I think that the ACLU's racial justice work is important for many reasons, but it's important in part because the ACLU does these kinds of First Amendment cases. So, I think it makes sense for the ACLU to be both a civil liberties and a civil rights organization.
So we're all agreed on that. Okay, now going to the microphones. I'm going to start over here, and Hector, could you please model for us how to introduce yourself before you're saying whatever you want to say?
Absolutely. Hector Viagra, I'm the executive director from Southern California, and the segue really could not have been more perfect. Jamil, you tweeted right after Charlottesville that those who contend government speech shouldn't suppress racist speech have a special obligation to counter that speech themselves, and I've really been trying to take that to heart. In terms of participating in the counter speech, what do you think that would look like? Should we be an active and visible part of the counter protests at a speech or a rally or an assembly that maybe we allowed to happen? Is that what you're envisioning? And I think maybe for all of the panelists, same question.
Yes, absolutely. I'm not sure I would limit it to that, but at the very least, if the ACLU is going to represent Jason Kessler or somebody like Jason Kessler and facilitate the kind of speech that we saw in Charlottesville, I think that ACLU staff should be on the other side of that line, and they should be visible to everybody else. I think that has to be part of it. I think you guys should think creatively about what else you can do, but you don't have to do that alone. There are other groups out there that I'm sure will have many ideas for you. But I think that it's a requirement. If you're going to do this kind of work, you have to do that kind of work too.
The best way to defeat speech by people who come to the campus to provoke people on the right who do that is to ignore them. The worst thing that can happen when you speak, write, or say something is for people to ignore you. That's the worst thing that can happen to you. So that I would think that ignoring them when they come and then the next day having a huge event in which people talk about what you want to talk about and who come out to demonstrate their views, where they differ with them. What they want is you to come while they're there and create a big disturbance so that they get more publicity. I would simply ignore them on that day. I wouldn't come and add heat to their activity.
So I would just, I don't know whether this is a disagreement or an amendment, but I think that the advice to ignore does make sense in situations like the group that I talked about at University of Hawaii. We've done a lot of ignoring because it's a small group. It's a campus where there are not a great number of people who are in agreement with them, and therefore without people coming with a counter protest or something, they can be ignored. But there are many of these campuses where there's significant numbers of people who are anxious to hear these speakers, and these speakers are picking, not necessarily University of California and, at Berkeley, but many of these campuses that they're going to in Texas and Florida, et cetera, they don't need the counter protesters to have a lot of people there and to have it look like, so then these guys are saying this is going to be another Charlotte. They don't need for us to show up and counter. I mean, I think we should, because there will be large numbers of them. But it isn't like this is, when you look at, maybe Trump didn't get the majority of the popular vote, which he didn't, as he claims, but a lot of people voted for them. And in many of these states where, and I think the other thing, even about the funding, is they're funders, the same people who are funding many of these politicians on the right are funding these inflammatory speakers. They're coming out of, it isn't like these organizations that you see on campus are needing to get their funds to bring the speaker from the university. They get their funds from right-wing groups that are interested in funding these things. And so I think that makes it complicated, both in terms of saying, well, the university just won't fund. But I think your idea about university in general having policies that all groups, whether they want to invite Farrakhan or want to invite someone, have to comply with, is a good idea, because those can be content neutral standards. But I think there's some situations where ignoring the speakers is going to be sufficient. But I think in this current climate, there are many places where there's students who are being attacked by these things, who are going to be very vulnerable, because there's so many students on those campuses who are sympathetic with this kind of speech.
Let me ask you this, Chuck, if I may. What if you're on one of these campuses down in wherever, someplace, where a majority of the people around the campus are Trump supporters, wherever that is in the country, and a speaker comes who's going to be provocative for them and do what they want to do, and instead of ignoring them, have people who are on the other side, progressives, the few who happen to be around or who can get there, to come out to protest them. And then you have altercations, and then you have media about all the stuff that happened and all around it. Whereas if they didn't go to protest them, you would have a story in the media about them coming to speak and all their buddies were there to help them. I mean, which one is better? I don't know. Neither, probably.
Well, I don't know that there's an ideal solution. I know that that certainly for students who are on these campuses who are just feeling assaulted by this presence, I think it's important for them to be able to speak against it. And I think one of the problems is we have Antifa and all these groups that are feeling like the only way to respond to these groups is with more, and I've never been supportive of that type of counter protest, even though Cornel West said, I was standing there singing This Little Light of Mine, and if these guys hadn't been around, right? And it does sort of give you the sense of how out of hand these things can get when you think about counter speech. Like, what does standing there singing This Little Light of Mine do against these guys marching on, So on the one hand, I've always, I sort of think that whenever I've been at demonstrations, I always, try to speak to and cool out the folks who are there with their faces covered in clubs on the other side, and but I do think that counter protest, even if it's only 5 of you standing up there saying this is wrong, is important. Yeah.
Okay. So moving to this microphone, Greg, please introduce yourself.
Will do. Thank you. My name is Greg Rose. I'm with the ACLU of California, San Diego and Imperial County affiliate, the long one. And I want to introduce to the discussion the third rail of the ACLU, which I think is the Second Amendment, in respect to, if we've decided we're not going to represent people, if their agenda includes violence and so on, what do you do in the face of open carry laws where you get the people, who were being invited specifically to, Charlottesville to sort of encouraged to bring their guns and show them? I mean, to me, that's already violence, even if they said, oh, yes, but we're not going to shoot those guns. And I particularly like to hear Dr. Barry answer that one because I love hearing her talk to herself.
Oh, okay. Well,
But just, Dr. Berry, before you answer, the suggestion has just been made to me so that we unfortunately have limited time, so that we can get more questions
Okay.
in. Why don't we hear from several people, and then at whatever point you want to
We'll
answer,
try
then
to
you can
remember
decide
the
what to respond to. So here's a pen if anybody wants to write down the questions, make notes. But so remember Greg's question, and then keep that in mind, and we'll hear from maybe two other people, and then invite some responses. Peter, introduce yourself.
Peter Simonson, I'm the Executive Director for the ACLU of New Mexico. Over the last several years, the ACLU, like many organizations, has embarked on an effort to try and become a more equitable and inclusive organization. And in my, definition of that, that means not just simply becoming a more diverse organization, but also an organization that invites people of color as well as white people to participate equally in the leadership of the organization, that the culture of the organization is welcoming to all parts of our staff, all parts of our lay leadership. And in the wake of Charlottesville, the ACLU staff, and I mean both national and affiliate, had a number of nationwide conversations during which I heard many staff express a great deal of regret, hurt, indignation over our decision to represent the white supremacists in Charlottesville. Many of those feelings were expressed by staff of color, and it raised a question for me that I would pose to you all, which is, can the organization achieve its vision of becoming equitable and inclusive if it doesn't modify its approach to the way we represent protesters in these kinds of situations?
One more question, and then I'll invite the panelists to address whatever you want. Go ahead, please identify yourself.
Okay, my name is Dr. Eric Small. I am the Equity Officer at the Florida affiliate. And I want to piggyback on the question that was just raised because I believe, and this is a challenge to all three speakers, because I believe that you've conceived of this conversation in the way that Enlightenment liberal Democrats would conceive of this conversation. That is, as a conversation about empirical and analytical facts for the purpose of achieving the truth, something like that. And I don't believe that's what's happening with Donald Trump and Gorka, Miller, and Stephen Bannon and all of them. And I'm happy that that point about the classroom came up, because we don't allow speech in the classroom that turns the classroom into a hostile environment for the people inside of the classroom. And what Trump and Gorka and the rest of them are up to is turning America, as if they needed to do much turning, but turning America into a hostile environment against African Americans, Hispanic Americans, immigrants, and the rest. And I don't believe you've answered that challenge. What happens when you are used to help change America from what it is or what we ideally hope it could be into a hostile environment against the very people you claim to be protecting?
Okay, Dr. Berry, would you like to start? You had your microphone poised.
I'm going to do all three of those real fast. The last two, I think I've already addressed. One of the things that I get impatient with, and I should not, is that because I get impatient with the fact that I've lived too long. That's what I get impatient with. And seen too much and studied too much and know too much. I think I know too much. And it hurts me because we have always been a hostile environment of African Americans. I don't understand people who think that we just arrived at the status of being marginalized today or yesterday, or we lost power and we had it, or we did this and now the country is racist. The country has been racist from its beginning, okay? And so you can't determine what policy you're going to have or how you're going to change your mission based on the fact that the country is now racist. The country's been racist. When I told you about Reagan, you don't believe me. But Reagan was a pure dude. I mean, what he did was totally racist. You didn't hear me when I said all those guys quit their jobs, that they didn't even have another job because they refused to implement what he said. Or, you know, George W. Bush and his civil rights division, what did the guy say over there who was supposed to be running voting rights? That he liked his coffee like, he liked his coffee like Mary Frances Berry, black and bitter. And that he wasn't going to do anything about voting rights because of that. But in any case, so it's not new. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that when people say you can't, you have to work on racial justice issues and not defend white supremacists because, you know, freedom of speech, whatever you said, the guy from New Mexico, because, you know, we just don't get it. In fact, I do get it. I get it, and I get it because we have to defend people. We don't have to defend all white supremacists. It depends on what the checklist shows when you get through doing the analysis and where it all stands with whatever else you're doing. But you cannot rule out absolutely that I'm not going to, I'm not under any circumstances because, America is now racist, and I'm just helping it become more racist. You're not helping it become more racist. There's no way you can be doing that. And so if you stand for civil liberties, you have to be willing to be open to this kind of analysis. And I said, add fighting white supremacy to what you do as an organization. So those are the two that I have answered.
So I want to speak to those same two for a moment. One is to say that I think in my talk I did make an attempt to address both the fact that these really important issues about this situation that we're in now. And I would say to Dr. Berry that the truth of the fact that we've always been in this situation doesn't mean we shouldn't reassess now because we didn't reassess earlier, right? That if we didn't understand something at one point in time, so it's exactly right that it's always been this way and that people are at this point where it's become super visible, people have been drawn to raise it, right, again. But it's true, from Reconstruction to today, I just finished reading Eric Foner's book again, and it's very clear that this has been here forever in this country. So, but I think it's important, and part of what I was trying to talk about is that this idea of our being an inclusive organization and listening to these voices, not because poor voices, they need to be listened to so they'll feel like they belong, but because they're bringing ideas and realities that we need to face together to our attention, right? That's the reason why the inclusion is important and the reason why we need to be open to listening to it. And part of the listening to it is to move away from a way of thinking about these things that says, well, we all have access to the same facts that we can just talk about, and we all have an equal ability to talk about them in these institutions. To recognize that never so, right? And recognize the powers on the other side that shape that conversation. And that's why I think that this idea that the campaign finance part of our work is directly tied to this. You know, it's directly tied to it.
It may very well be that, and I hadn't thought of that till now, it's because Obama was president. And a lot of us felt a whole lot better when Obama was president. And to many of us, it was symbolically something about a sea change in the way things operated in the country and signs of a more hopeful time. And for a lot of people, that was something they saw, and now they see it as turning back, something that they thought was moving toward a more progressive situation. So that's one of the things that makes some people so upset now with what goes on. And the second, and they don't take the long view of saying, well, you know, Obama, that was important, but he couldn't do everything either. And that progress goes in zigs and zags. It goes up and it goes down and it goes up. It never goes all the way back. And also, a lot of people just don't know the history, which is why we teach, because they don't know. I mean, I assume I know. Every semester when I go to class, I say, well, maybe I should skip over this first part of the class. I already know that. And then I realize, oh, no, I know it, but they don't.
Well, it's 2:10. We have 5 people standing at the microphones. Would it do too much damage to the rest of the day's schedule to hear from all 5 and then have quick responses? I'm asking the organizer. Who? Or we need to end? I'm terribly sorry, people who have been standing at the microphone, but we do have a lot of other interesting things. Now, before you start applauding for everybody, let me first say that I really want to thank so much our distinguished guests here. I know that it was last minute. Right. You all came a long way and you all have busy schedules, so we're so grateful for helping us have this conversation. I think this is a tremendously important conversation as well as a really interesting one. And part of what's important about it is I think what you've all been saying is that engaging in this conversation and continuing to will help us to grow as an organization and to help us to both be a racial justice organization and a free speech organization. And here's what I want to say to you in closing. This is not easy because we're a very large and diverse organization and people have different life experiences and different points of view. But if we at the ACLU cannot figure out how to bridge our different experiences and work together and do the critical work we need to do, what hope is there for the rest of the country? So thank you all.